there is a very particular kind of person, a small generation, almost stuck between two worlds, not entirely part of the past, but not truly born into the present either. Someone old enough to remember the feeling of waiting an entire week just to watch the next episode of a TV show. The excitement when the opening theme started playing. And if you missed that episode, you had to wait another whole week. But that same person is also young enough to remember downloading their first MP3 on dial-up internet, watching the progress bar move slowly, and hoping no one in the house would pick up the phone halfway through. Someone who used to write handwritten notes to friends, folding the paper in class, passing it across 3 desks, just to write one simple sentence. Do you want to hang out after school? But just a few years later, that same person would stay up until 2 a.m. chatting on Yahoo Messenger, waiting for a tiny line of text to appear, is typing. Someone who remembers leaving the house and being completely unreachable. No messages, no notifications, no one knowing where you were. But today, that same person has 5 different messaging apps on their phone, and every single one of them has someone waiting for a reply. Not Generation X, and not quite millennials either. And if you were born somewhere between 1977 and 1986, there's a good chance you've carried a strange feeling with you your entire life. A feeling that's hard to explain. You've always felt like you don't fully belong to any generation. You understand the old world, but you also had to adapt to the new one. You remember a time when technology was just a tool, and now you're living in a time when technology has become an entire way of life. And the thing is, that's not a coincidence. Introduction: my name is Philex, and I spend far too much time thinking about a strange question. Why do people born between 1977 and 1986 feel so different? If you're someone who grew up in a world without the internet, but came of age in a world that can't function without it, then hit subscribe and like this video if that feeling resonates with you. Because today, we're going to talk about something that most people have never really understood. Why people born between 1977 and 1986 think differently, work differently, and see life in a strangely unique way. And more importantly, how that experience shaped your psychology. And why. You may have felt this your entire life, but no one has ever truly explained it before. The people who grew up between two worlds, there is a very particular kind of memory that only a certain group of people have. Not everyone understands it. But if it belongs to you, you recognize it immediately. You remember standing in front of the TV, holding a VHS tape, carefully rewinding it all the way before returning it to the video rental store. Not because anyone forced you to do it, but simply because that was the rule. You had to rewind it before returning it. And then, a few years later, you remember something completely different. The moment you discovered Napster. Suddenly, music wasn't something you bought at a store anymore. It was something you searched for, waited for, and hoped I would finish downloading. You remember watching the progress bar slowly move across the screen, wondering whether the file would finish before the internet connection dropped. And this is where things get strange. You weren't someone who only grew up with streaming, but you also weren't someone who never experienced digital music. You lived through both realities: cassette tapes and Napster, handwritten notes and instant messages, calling someone's house phone, and later messaging them online at midnight. You didn't completely grow up in the old world, but you didn't fully come of age in the new one either. You grew up right in the middle of the transition, at the exact moment when one version of everyday life was quietly disappearing and another one was beginning to replace it. At first, that might not seem like a big deal, but psychologically, it matters far more than most people realize. Because the people who lived through that transition weren't simply learning new technology. They were doing something much more complex. They were building their identity at the exact moment when the structure of the world itself was changing. And when that happens, something very unusual begins to form. A mindset that doesn't quite fit with the generation before it. And it doesn't fully align with the generation that comes after. For years, researchers have struggled to explain this group. They tried to classify them. They tried to neatly fit them into existing generational labels. But those labels never quite worked. Because these people weren't defined by a single decade. They were shaped by a moment in history. The moment when analog life quietly faded and digital life rushed in to take its place. Most generations grow up within one stable version of the world. But this group didn't. They grew up between two worlds. And if you were born somewhere in the late 1970s or the early 1980s, there's a good chance you were one of them. The generation with no name for a long time. People like this didn't seem to have a name. They were too young to fully belong to Generation X. But somehow it is a little too early to feel like true millennials. They didn't grow entirely offline, but they also didn't grow up completely online. And for years, that strange in-between experience made them difficult to define. They didn't quite fit the labels that already existed. They weren't exactly part of the old world, and they weren't fully part of the new one either. They were something in between. And for years, that strange in-between identity left them until researchers noticed some people born roughly between 1977 and 1985 weren't just part of a typical generation. They didn't quite fit into the categories that already existed. They were too young to fully be Generation X, and somehow a little too early to feel like true millennials. So, researchers eventually realized something important. This wasn't just a normal generation. It was something smaller, something more precise, a microgeneration. Eventually, a name began to circulate for this group, Xennials. The term was popularized by journalist and sociologist Sarah Stankorb, who noticed that millions of people shared this exact same experience, growing up in an analog childhood but entering adulthood in a digital world. Xennials sit directly between two massive generations. They carry independence and skepticism often associated with Generation X. But they also learn to adapt quickly to the technology and cultural shifts that shaped millennials. And yet, they fully belong to neither. The window is surprisingly small, only about 8 or 9 years. A moment in history when the world was quietly transforming. Some people even call them the Oregon Trail generation, a reference to the classic computer game The Oregon Trail that many students played in school computer labs during the 1980s and 1990s. In the game, you guide a small group of travelers across a vast and uncertain frontier. You have limited resources. You face unexpected obstacles, and there is no clear path forward. You simply move ahead, making the best decisions you can with the information you have. And strangely enough, that game became the perfect metaphor for this microgeneration, because that is exactly what their real lives felt like. They grew up navigating a world that was changing faster than anyone expected, a world where the old map was fading and the new one hadn't been drawn yet. Part 3, Childhood Before the Internet. A completely different world. To understand this generation, you must understand something even more important. Their childhood happened in a world that no longer exists. A world before constant connection, before notifications, before searching bars, before the internet quietly became the background of everyday life. Back then, communication worked very differently. If you wanted to talk to someone in class, you didn't send a message. You wrote a note on a piece of paper, folded it carefully, and passed it across a few desks, hoping the teacher wouldn't notice. If you wanted to meet your friends after school, you didn't send a text to confirm. You simply agreed to meet at a place. A street corner, a park bench, the entrance to a mall. And once you left the house, that was it. There was no way to check if the other person was running late. No location sharing. No quick message saying, "I'm 5 minutes away." You either showed up, or you missed each other completely. Even entertainment worked differently. If you missed an episode of your favorite TV show, it didn't exist in some endless library waiting for you. It was simply gone. You waited all week for that moment. And if you miss it, you miss it. But perhaps the most important difference was something psychological. Mistakes in your youth were not permanently recorded. There were no screenshots, no viral clips, no endless archives of every awkward moment. You could say something embarrassing, get into an argument, go through a strange, rebellious phase that made no sense to anyone, including yourself. And slowly, those moments would fade. They would dissolve into memory. Because back then, most of life happened without a permanent record. And that changed something fundamental about how people grew up. Because when your mistakes are temporary, your identity has room to evolve. And that freedom shaped the people who came of age just before the internet changed everything. Part 4. The Science of Memory. There is a reason those early memories feel so different. And it isn't just nostalgia. It's neuroscience. Human memory was never designed to function like a hard drive. Your brain doesn't record life the way a camera does. It doesn't store every moment perfectly, waiting to be replayed forever. Instead, it does something far more sophisticated. It selects. Every experience you have passes through a quiet internal filter. Some memories are strengthened and preserved. Others slowly fade away. And this isn't a flaw with the system. It's the system working exactly as it was designed. Neuroscientists have long understood that memory serves two essential purposes. First, it helps us retain what matters, the moments that shape who we are. But just as importantly, it helps us let go of what doesn't. Embarrassing mistakes, awkward conversations, arguments that once felt enormous but eventually lost their weight. Over time, the brain softens those memories. It blurs the edges, not to erase the past, but to protect the future. Because if every painful or humiliating moment stayed perfectly preserved, emotional healing would be almost impossible. Identity would become frozen. Growth would slow down. For people who grew up before the internet became permanent record, this natural process had space to work the way it was meant to. Their childhood memories weren't constantly replayed by videos, screenshots, or online archives. They were processed internally, edited by time, reshaped by perspective. Which means that for this generation, childhood became something deeply human. Not a database, not a timeline, but a story. A story the mind quietly rewrites over time, keeping the meaning while letting the unnecessary details gently disappear. Part 5. The technology shock, and then, almost overnight, everything changed. For most generations, the world evolves slowly. The rules stay familiar. The tools improve, but the structure of everyday life remains recognizable. But for this group, the transformation didn't happen gradually. It happened right as they were becoming adults. In the late teenage years. In the early 20s. At the exact moment when people are trying to figure out who they are, the world itself suddenly rewrote the rules. New technologies didn't just appear. They exploded into everyday life. Suddenly, communication moved into inboxes through email. Phones were no longer attached to a wall. Music no longer comes from stores or CDs. It came from a strange new place called Napster, where millions of songs could be shared across the internet by complete strangers. And then something even stranger came. The early social internet. Websites where people build digital versions of themselves. Profiles, messages, friend lists. Platforms like MySpace quietly introduced a completely new idea. That part of your life could exist online. At the same time, faster internet connections began spreading into homes. Broadband started replacing the slow, fragile dial-up connections people had relied on for years. Information began to move faster. Communication became constant. And the pace of everyday life started accelerating in ways few people had ever experienced before. For those who had grown up in the analog world, this didn't feel like a small upgrade. It felt like stepping into an entirely different reality. The world they once understood, the rhythms, the rules, the expectations, began to quietly disappear. And in its place, a new digital landscape was forming. Unfamiliar, unpredictable, still being invented in real time. Most generations adapt to change. But this generation didn't simply adapt. They crossed a border between two eras. And that experience would shape the way they think about technology, identity, and the future for the rest of their lives. Part 6. A unique window in brain development. There is another reason this generation adapted so well to the digital revolution. And it has less to do with culture and more to do with biology. Neuroscience shows that the human brain continues developing well into the mid-20s. In particular, the regions responsible for learning complex systems, adapting to new environments, and building long-term habits are still maturing until around the age of 25. That timing matters more than most people realize, because the internet didn't arrive gradually for this generation. It arrived right in the middle of that developmental window, when many of them were in their late teens or their early 20s. At the exact stage of life when the brain is most capable of absorbing entirely new frameworks for how the world works. Now compare that with the generations around them. People from Generation X often encountered the internet later in adulthood. For many of them, learning digital systems felt like learning a second language later in life. Possible, but never entirely instinctive. And then there is Generation Z, who were born into a world where the internet was already everywhere. For them, constant connection is simply the default setting of reality. But the people in between experience something very different. They remember both worlds. They remember the strange freedom of being unreachable, leaving the house, and disappearing for hours without anyone knowing where they were. And they also know the opposite experience, a world where messages arrive instantly, where information is always within reach and where connection is almost constant. That dual memory created a kind of mental flexibility. They understand what life feels like without technology, and they understand what life feels like inside it. Which means this generation didn't just witness the digital revolution. In many ways, they were perfectly positioned to translate between the two worlds. Part 7. The economic shock. A psychological scar. Just as this generation was learning to navigate a new digital world, another kind of shock arrived. This time, it wasn't technological. It was economic. Many people born in the Xennial window stepped into the workforce right as the optimism of the early internet era collapsed during the dot-com bubble. Companies that once seemed unstoppable disappeared almost overnight. Jobs that looked secure weren't. For young adults just starting their careers, the message was subtle but powerful. The system could change without warning. And just as stability began to return, another disruption followed, far larger and far more global. The global financial crisis reshaped the job market again. Businesses closed. Careers stalled. Entire industries suddenly felt fragile. For people at the beginning of their professional lives, these back-to-back shocks arrived at a formative moment. Economists have a name for this pattern. They call it the scary effect. When major financial instability happens early in a person's career, it tends to leave a lasting psychological imprint. And you can see that imprint is the habits of this generation. They keep emergency savings, even when things seem stable. They quietly maintain Plan B, sometimes even Plan C. They hesitate before making commitments that stretch too far into the future. From the outside, it can look like caution, sometimes even anxiety. But for many people who live through those early shocks, it isn't fear. It's memory. Not just intellectual memory, something deeper, a kind of body memory. A quiet awareness that systems can shift, markets can collapse, and stability can disappear faster than anyone expects. And once you experience that kind of instability early in your career, something inside you changes. You become a little more cautious, a little more prepared, not because you expect the worst, but because part of you remember how quickly things can turn. Part 8. The bridge between generations. Because of everything they experienced, this small generation developed a role they never consciously chose. They became translators. People born in this narrow window often find themselves standing quietly between two very different worlds. On one side are older generations like Generation X, who tend to value structure, hierarchy, and clearly defined processes. Systems that were built slowly, carefully, and meant to last. On the other side are younger generations such as Generation Z, who grew up in a fast-moving digital environment. A world that rewards speed, flexibility, and constant reinvention. And somewhere in the middle stand the Xennials. They understand the language of both sides. They know why older colleagues value stability and proven methods. But they also understand why younger coworkers push for faster change, new tools, and fewer rigid rules. So naturally, they often become the ones who smooth tensions in the room. The ones who quietly explain one perspective to the other. They translate expectations. They mediate misunderstandings. They connect people who might otherwise struggle to understand each other. Psychologists have a term for this kind of work. It's called emotional labor. The invisible effort of managing relationships, easing conflicts, and maintaining social balance within groups. Most of the time, it goes unnoticed. But it requires patience, empathy, and a deep awareness of how different people see the world. And in many workplaces, families, and communities, Xennials end up carrying more of that invisible responsibility than they realize. Because when you've lived between two eras, you often become the person who helps everyone else learn how to Part 9. The cost of holding everything together, but quietly playing the role of a bridge comes with a cost. At first, it feels like a skill, the ability to understand different perspectives, to calm tensions, to explain one side to the other. But when you do it long enough, something subtle happens. It stops feeling like effort and begins to feel like responsibility. Not because anyone formally asked for it, but because everyone slowly begins to expect it. In meetings, you are the one who helps clarify misunderstandings. In families, you are often the one who keeps conversations from falling apart. In groups, you become the reliable center, the person people trust to keep things steady. Over time, that role becomes almost invisible, even to you. It simply feels like, that's just what I do. But underneath that quiet reliability, there is often a different reality, a kind of background exhaustion, the mental effort of constantly reading the room, the emotional responsibility of keeping people connected, the invisible pressure of making sure things don't fall apart. Psychologists often describe this as a hidden form of emotional labor, effort that rarely receives recognition but slowly drains energy over time. And the irony is that the people who carry it best are often the ones most likely to become exhausted by it. Because the same qualities that make them dependable, empathy, adaptability, awareness, also make it harder for them to step away. So, in many groups, Xennials become the most trusted people in the room, the ones others rely on when things get complicated. But trust and reliability can sometimes hide a quiet truth. The people who hold everything together are often the ones who need rest the most. Part 10. Living between two eras. If you go back to the image we started with, it tells the whole story. A person standing in front of a television, carefully rewinding a VHS tape before returning it to the video store. Years later, that same person sits in front of a computer, watching a progress bar slowly download a song from Napster. Two completely different worlds. And yet, the same life lived inside both. For people in this small generation, adaptation wasn't a special talent. It wasn't something they consciously trained for. It was simply something they had to do. Because while they were growing up, the ground beneath everyday life was quietly shifting. The systems they first learned, how to communicate, how to find information, how to build relationships, were slowly fading. And in their place, entirely new systems were appearing. Digital communication, online identities, constant connection. So they adjusted, not because they wanted to stand between worlds, but because the world itself moved while they were still learning how it worked. And that experience leaves a very particular kind of perspective. Most people grow up inside one stable version of reality. The rules stay mostly the same from childhood into adulthood. But this generation witnessed something different. They saw one version of the world quietly end, and they watched another begin. That doesn't just change how you use technology. It changes how you think about change itself. You learn that the systems around you are not permanent. That stability can shift. That entire way of living can disappear within a single decade. Most people spend their lives inside one era. But this generation lived on the narrow bridge between two. And once you've stood on that bridge, you never see the world in quite the same way again. Part 11. The skill that can't be taught in the end. The story of this generation isn't really about technology. It's about adaptation. People who grew up in this narrow window of time didn't just witness change. They lived through it. They watched familiar systems disappear. They learned new ones while the rules were still being written. And somehow, they kept moving forward without losing the memory of what came before. That experience creates something subtle but powerful, a kind of inner stability. Because when you've already watched the world transform once, you understand something others may not yet see. You understand that change is not the end of the story. It's simply the beginning of the next chapter. People who have lived through major change develop a quiet ability. The ability to remain steady when the world shifts. To adapt without abandoning who they are. To carry the wisdom of the past while still stepping into the future. They remember what life felt like when things were slower, more private, more temporary. And at the same time, they know how to move through a world that is fast, connected, and constantly evolving. That balance is rare, because it can't really be taught in a classroom. It can't be downloaded from the internet. And it doesn't come from reading about history. It comes from living through it. From standing in the middle of change and learning, day by day, how to move forward anyway. And perhaps that is the quiet strength of this generation. They know how to walk forward when the ground beneath them shifts. Not because they were trained to do it, but because at one point in their lives they already had to. Maybe that's the quiet truth about this generation. They didn't just grow up with change. They grew up inside it. And if this story felt strangely familiar, if parts of it sounded like your own life, then maybe you were standing on that bridge too. Between two worlds. Between two eras. And if that's you, I'd really love to hear your story. Leave a comment below and tell me the one thing you remember most about growing up between the analog world and the digital one. And if this video helped put that feeling into words, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, understanding where we came from is the best way to understand who we've become.